Hello rowers and possibly coaches, welcome back to this little kind of video lecture series. For today's topic, I'm going to be diving into the specifics of UT1 steady state sessions, how to set up a training session, how frequently you should do it, how long they should be, how to kind of determine all those. I'll give a couple examples of workouts that I like to use for that UT1 steady state when I am doing variations of just straight through, start to finish, no breaks. This is a kind of a second in a two-part series to the video I released earlier this week, and I'll kind of put that up in a pop-up box there, that white box. And in that video, I talked more about the concepts of UT1, exactly what is happening with the body, exactly how those training sessions should feel. So you could either check that out before you watch this and come back, or maybe check that out after you watch this. They don't necessarily have to come in any particular order. Quick summary from the last: UT1 steady states, UT1 training is going to be a high-end aerobic training zone, all right? So you're going to be at a place where you're really drawing a lot from your carbohydrates as energy stores. You're going to be working fairly close to threshold, and so you're going to be developing a lot of kind of muscular power. You're going to be generating a decent amount of muscular fatigue during that training session. You do want to make sure that that is muscular fatigue and not a lactate fatigue, and so you shouldn't be feeling a burn in your legs. You should just be feeling kind of an intense tiredness that comes as that interval, as that workout progresses from beginning to end. It is important to remember that it is an aerobic training session, and one of the best ways to kind of know whether you're training aerobically or anaerobically is to monitor your breathing. And so if your breathing is controlled, even if it's controlled in heavy or deep or rapid, rapid kind of being a questionable adjective to use there, but if you're breathing fast but it's still in a controlled manner, so you could kind of change your breathing pattern successfully without suddenly being out of breath or kind of caught needing to take a breath immediately, then that is a sign that you're training aerobically. As soon as you cross over that aerobic threshold and you're on the anaerobic side of that threshold, then your breathing will become rapid, it will become less controlled, you won't be able to change the rhythm. It's just going to kind of happen, and it's going to be deep, it's going to be fast, and it's going to increase in that way as you continue to develop lactic acid in your bloodstream because you're on that anaerobic side of threshold. But with that UT1 training, UT1 is really going to form one of the two main foundations of your training if you're training in rowing for either a mid-distance or distance event and beyond, all right? And I define mid-distance as pretty much anything of 500 meters and up, certainly encompassing the 1,000 meter and 2,000 meter race distance, as well as your head race distances. For the 500 meters, depending on kind of how fast you are, you might kind of be in a transition zone where you could succeed or compete successfully at that with just long sprint training, but you will also definitely benefit and not be harmed by doing training with endurance, all right, focused on endurance and focused on that aerobic base. In that UT2 training, which is kind of a long, firm, sustainable effort, is going to make up the base of your training. UT1 training is going to be kind of like spice and seasoning on that UT2 during the primary base building phase, but as you transition to the competitive phase, it's going to encompass a lot more of your aerobic training. And the splits that I use whenever I'm training in a base building period, and generally this is going to encompass about 8 to 9 months of your annual cycle. If you're using a single peak, then the percentage of minutes in UT2 is generally going to fall around 82-83%, and the percentage of minutes in the UT1 training zone is generally going to fall a little bit above 8%, so about 8.1 or so percent of those training minutes. As you transition to the competitive phase, and so maybe about 3 or 4 months out from competition, you're going to start transitioning that percentage to encompass less UT2 training and more UT1 training. And so that UT2 training is going to restrict down into about the 52%, and your UT1 percentage is going to come up to about 30 to 31% of your training minutes. And so you're essentially kind of training the body to just start to kind of move a little bit quicker, the legs to move a little bit quicker. There is a distinct difference between the kind of the rhythm of UT2 rowing and UT1 rowing. UT2 rowing is there's a lot more weight behind the stroke. The stroke rates are lower in the high teens, and so it's going to afford the flywheel more time to slow down between strokes, and then that flywheel is going to feel heavier as a result. As you're moving up into the lower 20s to mid 20s, which is the stroke rate range you're going to be for UT1, which is generally 22 to 24, maybe with a little bit of 21 and 25 at the beginning and end of those work periods, depending on kind of what your goal is. But those rhythms and those 20s is going to start to look a lot more like the power per stroke that you're going to be executing at a race rhythm. And so it's going to be a little bit quicker, it's going to be more tappy, whereas the UT2 is going to be a lot more accelerated because there's a lot more weight to work on accelerating. And if you use kind of a common analogy of spinning a wheel, so if you put two wheels on an axle, one of those wheels could be a car wheel, and another wheel can be a bicycle wheel. All right, and that car wheel, there's a lot of weight behind it, and so if you're just kind of tapping that wheel to get it to spin on that axle, you got to put a good amount of force behind that push to kind of get that wheel going and moving, and you're never going to get it quite at that top speed because there's so much weight to it, whereas the bicycle wheel is a lot lighter, it's a lot easier to tap, and therefore as it is getting faster, you just got to move a lot quicker with your hands to kind of keep that wheel spinning. All right, and that kind of rhythm is going to start to manifest at UT1 training paces, and it's definitely the rhythm that you're going to have when you're in a race training. And that when you're racing, it's kind of more of a racing bicycle wheel that you're just kind of tapping really quick, and maybe at UT1 you're looking at more of kind of like a mountain bike wheel. All right, so maybe a little bit more weight, but still way quicker than that tire from your car. All right, and so there's a big split there. And so there's your kind of rhythm per stroke. And we talked about the percentage of your training minutes that you want to be doing those sessions. And now the next question is, how long should I be doing for each of my UT1 sessions? And generally a good guideline, I say, is about somewhere between 1/2 and 1/3 of your typical UT2 steady state duration. All right, so you could, by typical, you could mean median steady state, or you could mean the average or the mean steady state that you're using. All right, you're definitely not using your longer ones. So let's say your UT2, 60 minutes is an easy number for that. So let's say 60 minutes is kind of your typical duration for your UT2. Once a week or so you do a longer UT2, maybe 80 or 90 minutes, but that 60 minutes is kind of your core, your primary distance. And so in that case, based on what I was saying, about 1/3 to 1/2 of that distance, your UT1 training duration would be about 30 minutes. All right, so each UT1 session is about 30 minutes long. As you're moving up, if your typical UT2 training session is 80 minutes, then you can kind of bump it up and you can do 40 minutes of UT1 at a time. And now there's certainly exceptions to that rule where you may want to go a little bit longer. If you're only doing maybe 4 to 6 training sessions a week, then you probably want to stay around that 50%. If you're doing multiple training sessions a day, maybe you're getting like 12, 13 or more training sessions during a week, then you might want to kind of flirt with going a little bit beyond that 50%. I want to go much more than 60% though of whatever your typical UT2 training session is for that UT1. Frequency is a powerful training stimulus. In a lot of ways, frequency is a more powerful training stimulus than just straight volume. But there are there's no definitive yes or no between those two. All right, so I would say in a lot of situations, frequency is a more powerful training stimulus than volume. But that's assuming you've reached a certain amount of volume. And so a good example of that is, if someone were doing a bunch of 30-minute training sessions, let's say they were doing 10 30-minute steady states over the week, I would say they're going to get a lot more benefit of them doing 5 60-minute training sessions a week than they would from those 10 30-minute training sessions a week. But then if someone was saying, okay, well, I want to go to 10 hours of training, then I would say there's going to be times where it would be better to kind of split those steady states up, so you're not just doing 5. If you're doing 5, they're not doing 5 2-hour rows, that you're kind of mixing up and maybe getting a bunch of 60-minute rows in, a couple 80 or 90-minute rows in, and maybe some shorter 30-minute rows. And so no firm answer there. That's something where you should talk to a coach and help you determine that. But trying to kind of pull back from that tangent in terms of volume. And so if you have an athlete that's 40 minutes, or 10K is a popular thing, which takes a lot of people around, a lot of male athletes at least, around 40 minutes, maybe 45 or so for female athletes, then a UT1 duration should be about 20 minutes. And you might even start to go more to that third and might stay closer to that 15 minutes. And so it's a good rule of thumb to say that you should stay closer to 1/3 of your typical UT1 session if your UT2 sessions are shorter. If your UT2 sessions are starting to get into the 60 range and above, and you're doing a lot of them, then maybe keep your UT1 in about the 50% of that UT2 volume. And then we talked briefly about the stroke rate ranges. And so your stroke rate range for UT1 is generally going to be around 23, 24, maybe down to 22, maybe even as low as a 21 if you're very early in that steady state session. So maybe if you're doing 40 minutes of UT1, then maybe starting the first 5 minutes or so at 21 before settling into a 22, 23 for the next 10 or 15 minutes, before you then settle into a 23, 24 for the bulk of that UT1 session. Now, steady state is going to be the primary way and the most effective way to train UT1. And generally, steady state without any rest period is going to be the best way to train any aerobic system. All right. And so I'm a big advocate for, if you can, if it's easy to do it mentally, then just kind of go straight through for your steady state. It's going to be more effective to do 90 minutes of steady state without any breaks than do 3 by 30 minutes of steady state with a minute or two break in the middle in there. And like I would say with UT2, if you're breaking up UT1 into intervals because you feel like you need to get up and stretch, that you're really tight, you're loose, or you feel like your back would hurt or some other joint would hurt if you're going straight through, then for me as a coach, that's a huge red flag that you're training too much volume. All right, if your body is not able to go straight through an aerobic session without some kind of overuse or extra fatigue or mechanical pain versus just kind of being tired, or maybe well, you shouldn't have lactate pain, but just being tired, then that's kind of a good sign that there's something else in your training, that you need to focus on the stabilizing muscles before you kind of get back into that volume. And that might be a good instance where doing more frequency is going to help. So for you, if doing 40 minutes of UT1 just puts a little bit too much strain on your back, then maybe do a few more 30-minute sessions instead of 2, or instead of 3 40-minute sessions, do 4 30-minute sessions spread out over a couple weeks. Now, there are times where you might want to split up your UT1 into multiple sessions. And so generally I would not do this if you're training more than 20 minutes of UT1. But if you're training 20 minutes or less of UT1 based on the volume of UT2 that you're used to doing, then it might be helpful to split up into intervals. All right, so like a 5-minute interval with a 1-minute rest could be good. So you're doing 4 by 5 minutes, 1 minute rest instead of 20 minutes straight through. You could split that into 4 minutes or 3 minutes. And generally, a lot of times with my younger athletes or less experienced athletes, I use this a lot with my master's athletes that are just getting into the sport. Definitely with middle school athletes, and certainly when I'm introducing UT1 efforts to novice rowers, we'll start with 3-minute intervals with 1 minute of rest. And what I'll do with those is we'll just kind of bring the stroke rate down a little bit more. So I'll stay more in the 20 to 22 range for the stroke rate of that, rather than the more typical 23 to 24 range. and we'll just get a little bit more power per stroke. And that aligns with what I'm trying to achieve with those athletes that are kind of earlier in their career, where developing a good sense of being aggressive per stroke and relying on your drive time to get impulse rather than just relying on an increased stroke rate to get the split down is going to be an important lesson for those athletes. And UT1 is a great way to kind of train that and develop it, because you can split that into intervals, let's say 3 minutes on, 1 minute off. They can be really aggressive at that 20 to 22 stroke rate, but the rate is still low enough that 1 minute recovery is more than enough for them to get back into it and still maintain a good aggressive drive. And then you can also get a lot more volume than if you were training that kind of, high power per stroke at AT or transport pace. And so the volume is going to be the same. You're counting just the volume of the work, not the volume of the rest. And so if you're doing 4 by 5 minutes with 1 minute off, that's 5 minutes of UT1 work. That's not 24 minutes of UT1 work. And then for the upper limit of the training, and so if someone is a elite level athlete, or that would encompass any kind of high level collegiate athlete, or maybe even a top end youth athlete, generally I would max out the amount of time that you should be training UT1 at 50 minutes. I don't think it's super valuable to go beyond 50 minutes, definitely not more than 55 minutes of UT1. Once you're getting to that point where your training volume dictates that you can be getting in a lot more UT1, and it may be telling you to be getting more than 50 minutes in or so a week, then at that time I would suggest splitting up and just doing more frequent sessions. And so if we take all that together and we're like, okay, well, let's look. We know in a general base building phase that your UT2 is going to be about 80 to 83%. Your UT1 is going to be about 8%. And so that's fortunately very easy. So that's about 10% of your UT2 volume is going to be in UT1. And so then you could look at your training. Let's say we're doing 60-minute steady states, and we've said that for UT1, that our UT1 volume should make up about half, on a per session basis, should make up about half of that UT1 session. So that's 30 minutes. So most of our UT2s are 60 minutes. So UT1 should fall around 30 minutes, maybe as low as 20 minutes. And so then you could say, well, once I've done 5 UT2 sessions of 60 minutes, then I'm due for a UT1 session of 30 minutes. All right, and so you can kind of figure out your training frequency there. And so that's 6 training sessions. And so in a given week during the base building training phase, you can say I'm going to do 5 60-minute UT2 sessions, and I'm going to do 1 UT1 session of 30 minutes. And then there's going to be other sessions that are going to train your anaerobic threshold or your transport. But if you're training at that volume where you're putting in about 330 minutes a week of steady state, and then chances are you're only going to be doing your transport and your AT training once or twice a month at the most between that, because your volume is fairly low. And this is going to be typical of kind of a recreational level athlete or an athlete that's competitive, but they're not training to compete at a very high level. Of that kind of 5 to 7 training sessions a week in that duration. If you're more recreational and you're just getting, let's say, 40 minutes of training 3 times a week, then you can kind of extrapolate that and say, okay, well, 40 minutes, that means I should probably be doing 15 minutes of U1 training in that period. And so for 15 minutes of U1, I want to accumulate about 150 minutes of UT2 before I do that, because remember, UT1 is about 10% of UT2. So that comes out to about after every 4 sessions of 40 minutes of UT2, you've got about 160 minutes of UT2. So you're due for about 15 minutes of UT1 in a training session. Now then we can say, okay, for that specific UT1 training session, 15 minutes is my volume there. So does that mean I'm just hopping on the erg and I'm rolling for 15 minutes? No, all right. So that 15 minutes is just calculating the amount of time that you're spending at that UT1 pace, all right? For a UT1 session, for an entire workout session, how I would set it up is I would still get loose, sit down in the air, get loose, and warm up the exact same way as you would for the beginning of a UT2 training session. All right, so you sit on, you kind of start patiently, you start at a very slow pace, you give your body time to kind of loosen and warm. The pace is increasing not because you're pushing harder, but because the muscles are warming and you're getting a little bit more supple in your motions, and that power should come naturally. And so you're going through however much that warm-up may be. Maybe if you're very young and spry, it'll only take you 5 minutes to kind of get loose and warm. You know, if you're kind of maybe a little bit older but fit, 10 minutes might be good enough. If you're starting to kind of age and you're starting to get into your 50s, 60s, 70s, then it might be 15 or 20 minutes to get yourself to that loose, and you're starting a lot slower and you're a lot more patient into the progression. But however long it takes for your warm-up, you do that warm-up, and then after that warm-up, you would do what I would consider a transition 5 minutes, all right? So ideally at the end of that warm-up period, whether it's 5 minutes, whether it's 20 minutes, you're gonna finish that warm-up at whatever your UT2, your base pace is gonna be for UT2 sessions. And then you wanna spend about 5 minutes, if you're doing a UT1 day, 5 minutes transitioning from that UT2 pace to that UT1 pace, all right? And so to kind of use simple numbers, if your UT2 pace is typically a 2-minute split, and you're doing a 2-minute split in an 18 stroke rate, then your UT1 pace is probably gonna fall somewhere around a 155, a 154, and your stroke rate for that UT1 is gonna be about 23 or 24 stroke rate. And so you're gonna take that 5 minutes to just transition from that 2 minutes at an 18 to that UT1 pace. Now, I wouldn't go all the way to that UT1 pace right away. I would kind of go maybe a split or two below what you typically average for your UT1. And so let's say this person, they usually do steady state at a 2-minute split. They usually do their UT1 sessions where they're averaging a 154. So I would take that 5 minutes and transition from that 2-minute split to a 156 and do that gradually. So maybe the first minute you're rowing a 159 at a 19-20 stroke rate, and then you're rowing a 158 at a 20-21 stroke rate, and then you're rowing a 157, 156 at a 21-22 stroke rate, and that kind of is where you are at the end of that 5-minute transition period. And then I would reset the monitor at that point so that let it count up, and then continue with your 15 minutes at a UT1 pace. And then at the end of that 15 minutes, you can just look at your average split for that 15 minutes, and that is your average for the UT1 portion. And then I would continue, and I would just paddle out for about 5 or 10 minutes after that, or get up and walk around just to get loose after that period. Now, within that UT1 period, if you're just doing 15 minutes of UT1, then you might quickly get from the beginning of that 156, and then it might only take you 5 or 10 minutes to settle into a 155, 154 for that UT1 pace. And then you just finish it out, and maybe you finish at a 153, so you start a little bit slower than your typical average for UT1, you finish a little bit faster. If you're talking about a longer, so let's say we're doing 40 minutes, you can get a little bit more kind of deliberate with that pace. Now, in that other video that I published earlier this week, I talked a lot about the threshold and what it means to be training near the threshold, and what it feels like to be near the threshold, and what it feels like when you just cross over that threshold a little bit. And now UT1 pace, and it may have kind of come off from that talk, because I talked a lot about the threshold, because it was a very definitive kind of line in the sand in terms of what's happening with your body. Your UT1, you're going to benefit from actually not training at your threshold from UT1, which is maybe how it came off in that video, but you're probably going to benefit from training maybe a second or two below what your known threshold is. And so I would say maybe every 4 or 5 UT1 sessions, really kind of pushing for that feeling that I talked about in that last video, and kind of pushing that pace to kind of see, is your threshold a little bit faster than it was before? So if you're used to finishing a UT1 training session at a 154 and still feeling very aerobic, then maybe every 3 or 4 UT1 training sessions, you can kind of try in the last third or so of that UT1 volume. All right, so if you're training 40 minutes, maybe in the last 10 or 15 minutes of that 40 minutes, push into a 153 and see how you finish that training session. Do you finish that training session where you're starting to feel a little bit of burn in the legs, Well, if you are, then chances are that 154 is still your threshold pace. It's still good for that UT1. If you're finishing that 153 for the last 10-15 minutes and you still feel aerobic, you're definitely tired, all right? You've done a lot of good work at UT1, but you don't feel a burn in your legs, then that's a great sign that that volume that you've been putting in has improved your threshold pace, and that you can now row at a 153 without worry of crossing over into that anaerobic training system. But again, I would only constantly be putting that pressure to kind of test to see if you're getting faster on the UT1 every 3 or 4 training sessions for UT1. For the rest, I would take whatever your average UT1 was before, what you know is at your UT1, and train maybe a second slower than that, just to kind of help ensure that you can accumulate the volume that you need. Because there are going to be days where you feel good and days where you feel bad, all right? And you don't want to be able to, you don't want to go in to each training session assuming it's going to be a good day and sabotage yourself if it's a bad day. So if on that given day you know your UT1 split is typically a 154, then I would again finish that transition phase, settle into a 157, 156. If you find after 5 or 10 minutes that you're kind of almost biting at the bit and it's really hard to hold yourself back at that 157, 156, then maybe after 5 or 10 minutes, allow yourself to kind of settle into that 156, 155. And if you're rowing that 156, 155 for 10, 15, 20 minutes, and you find yourself again, you're constantly trying to kind of push into that 155 range, and maybe even 154, then you can kind of release the reins a little bit and let yourself then settle into 155 and see that 154 every once in a while. But the good thing is that generally once you've gotten 10 minutes or so into a UT2 effort, you will get past that kind of initial feeling of, whoa, I feel really great and strong and fresh. And your true feeling of how your body is feeling that day will kind of take over, all right? And so you'll be past that kind of honeymoon period at the beginning of your workout where you feel good because you haven't accumulated in fatigue, and how you're feeling after that first 10-15 minutes will be a true indication of what you're capable on that day. And when you're trying to hold a split, and this is a really good kind of pacing strategy, whether it's UT1, UT2, and even for if you're testing on the erg for 2,000 meters, if you have a target pace and you are having to hold yourself back from constantly bumping over, so let's say target pace is 154, and you're trying to hit a 155 in that early place, and you're constantly bumping into 154 and you're constantly reminding yourself to slow down, then that's a good sign, all right? That's a good sign that you're fresh. But you're still holding that 155, but the variation in that split is on the faster side. If you're sitting and your target is 155 and you're hitting a lot of 156s and the 155s are just kind of only what you do every once in a while, or maybe you're holding 155 a lot, but when you do vary from that, you're varying and you're hitting a 156 or 157, then that's a sign that you're not super fresh that day, that you're kind of more on the conservative end of your split, and instead of continuing to push that 155, you're all right settling into that 156. And so hopefully that kind of covers all the scenarios for the UT1. We talked about how much of your total training volume it should be, about how long each individual session should be, the stroke rate ranges you should be doing, when it's appropriate to kind of row it straight through versus splitting it up into intervals, whether it's 5 minutes on, 1 minute off, 4 minutes on, 1 minute off, 3 minutes on, 1 minute off. I would keep that rest kind of low. I think that minute is a good kind of maximum for that rest for UT1. It's more than enough to kind of catch your breath and get back into the session. And you also don't want to be resting for a long period of time because that's kind of defeating the purpose of that aerobic training stimulus. But if you are training 25 minutes or more, preferably 20 minutes or more for UT1 in a session, I would definitely encourage you to go straight through and not to do intervals, all right? And if your choice is between doing 25 minute or 20 minutes straight through or doing 25 minutes, 5 minutes on, 1 minute off, go with the 20 minutes straight through, all right? Because it will create a better training stimulus to train straight through. And I think that kind of covers all the data for setting up that training session, what to do, when to do it, how long it should be. Again, I will remind you, as you're transitioning into your competitive phase, you want to kind of start to move to where your UT1 training is 10% of your UT2 training to where it is about 60% of your UT2 volume. All right, and make that gradually. It's not like 1 week you flip the switch, where it's 10%, and the next week it's 60%. It's a gradual thing. So maybe take a month to make that transition where your dominant aerobic training zone is UT2 versus where your dominant aerobic training zone is still UT2, but you're having a lot more UT1 in there. So before signing off today, guys, I wanted to put a quick ask out there for you. If you are not aware, I do have a sister channel to this, Rowing Resource, which is a project I started about 1.5 years ago. It's centered around a podcast that is focused more on the coaching education side than the athlete and general public's education side. It's a little bit more formal, but through that Rowing Resource, I did set up a Patreon on patreon.com/Rowing Resource, and that gives listeners a chance to contribute to the channel, a couple bucks a month, whatever fits within your budget, to support the continued creation of content like this. Right now, certainly I have a lot more time because I can't coach in my normal fashion during the kind of COVID isolation and lockdown, but that will certainly change in the future. But even when I am coaching, that is kind of a small population, and the education that I'm doing here with these videos reaches a lot more people, and hopefully therefore makes a much greater impact. And so if you are the ones impacted by that, and you have a couple bucks a month that you can give through that Patreon to help support the continued creation of content like this, even beyond this COVID lockdown, then certainly I wouldn't mind kind of giving up a couple days worth of salary a month, doing my regular coaching to devote to producing more content like this that will help a much broader population. So that is my pitch. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate it, especially all the comments that you guys put down there to kind of engage and kind of enhance the quality of the conversation a little bit more. But if you can give a little bit, I appreciate it. If not, then you can definitely support the channel by liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing if you aren't subscribed already. So that's it. This is Travis signing off. Take care, guys, and we'll catch you on the next video.
Thank you.